This is Mary Lou Frost. I'm about to give you a tutorial through video of the topic of dodging and burning. It's been around for a long time, back to days of printing where it was done in the darkroom, and in recent years it has been updated very powerfully through the use of luminosity selections. But I'm going to do two videos. This is part one is an overview, and the second one will get into more detail with the use of luminosity selections. Wherever you pick this up, you will have had practice images available to you, and I hope you have downloaded them or made them available. And if so, we are going to go and start by opening. If you'll go to File Open in the application you're using and navigate to where you placed those images on your computer, we're going to open the one that says Snickerdoodle Example PSD. So select it and open it. This is a very small image. It's one that I took as a screenshot because I thought it was useful for the first part of this tutorial. So you don't have much ability to enlarge it. It's already at 100%. But it's going to help us to take a look at some tools which I don't use very often, but they are part of the burning and dodging procedures. And so I'm going to have you look at this and notice that there are two faces that are completely in the shade. And one is the baby and the other is the boy. And they are, because it's such a small area, I'll show you a technique that can be used to lighten those that you may not know exists. But because these tools must work on a pixel layer, we're going to come over to the Layers panel and copy the background layer. You can do it by going to Layer, Duplicate Layer, and if you do it that way, you can name that layer if you wish, and I'm going to be dodging on it. And I'm also going to use a sponge type of tool. So I'm just writing it. But if you went to this directly from Control or Command J, you won't have had, it won't interrupt for you to name it. But you can always name a layer by double clicking on the layer name and just typing whatever you want. Having gotten to there, I'd like you to look at the tools. And if I'm doing this in Photoshop Elements to be of the most benefit to the newcomers, but also because it's a much cleaner looking interface when I do a video. And the same things I do here can easily be done by referring to Photoshop CC or earlier Photoshops also. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for a tool that it's a sponge tool when I see it. The key to it is the letter O. So you could find it by typing an O on your keyboard. When you find it, it comes in three sections. Elements always has its option bar at the bottom, whereas full Photoshop will always have its option bar at the top of the window. And of those three, there's one that looks a little like a lollipop, and that's the dodge tool. And that hand is the burn tool. And the sponge, I'm going to show you, is a sponge tool. All we're going to use for this little bit is the dodge tool, followed by the sponge. So we're on another layer, and it's very hard to work on a small item. So I'm going to my zoom tool, and right in the middle, I'm going to zoom once. Now, I'm above 100%, so in consequence, it loses some sharpness, but it's much easier to work on. And of course, when I put it back to 100%, the sharpness will return. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go back to that tool that I was using before, which is in the group that has a sponge, and it's the one that is called Dodge. And once you use this tool, you have a few things to decide. There's a range option, and when you pop it open, you can choose to work on shadows, midtones, or highlights. I'm going to take shadows to make the most change, but this isn't that dark. You probably could actually work on midtones, but we're going to stick with shadow for now. And you'll notice that the brush is soft, which is what I want. And then you have an exposure option. And the exposure just tells you how quickly you're going to be dodging where you brush. And I tend to use a fairly low setting. And I think in this one I was somewhere around 15%. And when I get ready to work, I take my brush tool over it, and I want to make sure that the size easily fits within the baby's head. If you have a large brush size, you'll go to the letter P on your keyboard and choose the right bracket key, which will make it bigger, or if it's too big, you use the left bracket key, and that will make it smaller. I'm satisfied with mine, and I want to keep away from the flower. I want to just get to the face. So I'm going to hold this down and go around the face and back. When you do any of these special tools, you'll want to keep your finger on the mouse button while you're working. When you lift it up, if you put it down again, you'll be taking away more and lightening it further. And if I want to know whether it looks to me like that's okay, I can always come up to this Dodge sponge layer on the layers panel and look at the eyeball in front. And by clicking it, I'll turn off that layer and the face goes back. So for this point, I've lightened enough. Now I'm going to come back and do something else with the sponge tool, but let's take our up to the boy's face. And again, keep your mouse button down as you go around his face, and be sure you don't miss anything, any part of it. Be sure you've covered it completely. Then you can lift your mouse, and again, if you want to see your work so far, you go to that eyeball on the top layer, turn it off and turn it on. Now, when you dodge with this tool, you lose some color. It desaturates as well as lightening. And so we're going to use the sponge tool to bring back a little of the saturation so those faces look like they belong to the others on the page. So I will go over and choose the sponge tool, and I want it set to saturate. I can have either desaturate or saturate. In this case, I want to saturate some color back. My brush is still soft and it's still very low in percentage. And if you choose a low percent and you've not done enough, you can always go back and do more. So let me get up here and go around the baby's head, around along here on a very low saturation. And then I'm going to come to the boy and I'm going to brush on just a little bit of color back the way it was. And then if I want to see what my last activity, my saturation, did, I need to go to the history panel, and in the history panel, I have every step of what I've done since I opened this image. And the last two steps were the sponge tool. So if I back up to the last time I used the dodge and click it, I'll see the effect before I applied the sponge tool. And then I can click each one, restore the sponge to the baby, and restore the sponge to the boy. So it just gives a very natural look. And then if I want to see the before and after, I only have one layer above the background, so I can simply turn the layer off and turn it on. Okay? And I'm not going to work to perfection here. I just wanted you to see those. Now, I almost never use these unless I have a very small area in a picture which needs to be either lightened or darkened, and it's easier to do it here. And then when I'm done, the next thing I'm going to tell you is something I rarely do. I am never, once I'm satisfied with this, I'm never going to go backwards on this step of the image. So there is no reason that I need to maintain 2 layers and double the size of the file. I always keep my work if there's any chance I would go back, but this is a kind of small repair I don't need to keep. So I am going to go in and I'm going to go layer, and I'm going to flatten that image. And then I can go ahead and save it and move ahead. And of course, I could do any other development I wanted with it. But the only reason I chose this was to show you a little bit of what those special tools can do. So I'm not going to save this at all. I'm just going to close it and say don't save. And that means if you want to practice with this another time you have the original file. We're now going to look at another basic dodge and burn where we use its own layer. And for that, I'm going to go to File, Open. And the other one that you will have had is Cranes 6053. So I'm going to click on that file and open it. In this file, I have a more typical problem where I would like to lighten very dark shadows on some of the body of the birds, especially on the feathers on the right side of the image. But I know that there's no way I could brush over those feathers and not be touching the blue sky. And so I'm going to set up the dodge and burn and show you the traditional method, and then show you by far the best method that we have, which I will work with in more detail in the second video. So what we're going to do here is make a traditional dodge and burn layer. If you have already gotten the actions from Tony Kuiper, you know that he gives you an action to create this layer. But here I'd just like to show you how we do it. If you go to the torn piece of paper, or in the latest versions of Photoshop CC, it's a rectangle with a plus sign in the middle. In any case, when you point to it, it'll tell you you're going to create a new layer. And so if you click on it, you've got that new layer. And to work with it as a dodge and burn layer, we have to fill it with 50% gray. So if you'll come to the Edit menu where you see Fill, Fill Layer is what appears in Elements. Just the word Fill is there in full Photoshop. So when I do, I have to look what it says Use, and I have to pop that open. And notice that I can use 50% gray. So I click on that and say, OK. Oh my goodness, I've lost my image. Well, that's because I didn't change the blend mode of this layer. The way normal layers work, they cover up the layer below. If there are pixels in this layer, they will cover up the ones below. But if we change that blend mode from normal to either overlay or soft light, and the only difference being overlay is a little stronger effect than soft light. But let's just click overlay, and immediately your picture comes back. A 50% gray layer is not visible until you paint on it. And I'm going to show you how we can dodge some of those shadows and get a thing that's lighter. And I want you to know the first method I'm going to show you is the old-fashioned method, and you will pretty quickly see why it has problems. So in order to work on the front bird, I'm going to zoom in so that I can see quite well where I'm going to work. Now, I recognize that the lighting on this subject put that in shadow. So I don't want it to look artificial, but I would just like to have a little more detail visible in it. So I'm going to paint on that area with a white brush at low opacity. And because I'm painting on this layer, you will see the results in the picture as I work on it. So I'm going to take the brush tool, and I want to grab if you don't have the original black and white colors, you either hit D for default, or you hit the little black and white squares, and then you say, I want to work with white to lighten. So I have either an X for exchange or the bent arrow, which puts the white on top. The brush tool always works with the foreground color. I then want to look at the option bar. And again, I'm in Elements, so I have my option bar down below, and Photoshop users will have it on top. And I'm going to show you that when you come over to here, there's a little nice keyboard trick for making the brush softer or harder. It's awkward to pop it open and try to decide which of those you want. But just as we make our brush larger or smaller with the bracket keys next to the letter P, you can change those and make them softer or harder by adding the shift key. So if I hold the shift key down and then I come to the keys that are next to the letter P, if I want it to be sure it's soft enough, I'm going to use the left key and make it so I know it has fuzzy edges. Just for you to know what it did, keep that shift key down and use the right square bracket key, and notice how it gets hard. Come back to the left. You have more control over how hard or soft it is by this method, and it's a great deal easier to do. So I'm now sure that I have a fuzzy edge on my brush, so I can lift the shift key up. And I want to be sure I'm in a normal brush mode. It will be there unless you have done something kind of unusual with the last time you used the brush, but you want it normal. And then the opacity is the next thing. And I always start with low opacity. I'm going to come down about 25%, because when you're using a dodge and burn layer and you brush several times and lift your finger off the button, you will keep lightening it further. And so I don't have to get it perfect the first time. And so I'm putting my mouse over. It's obviously too big, the brush. So I take the left bracket key next to P, and I'm going to bring it down till I think it's going to work through that partition there in the middle, and I'm going to be able to cover quite a bit of this area. But in this old traditional method, I have to be awfully careful. I keep my brush inside the dark area so I don't lighten the blue. And I wanted to do this just to show you the benefit of the new method. So I'm going to start up here with my mouse button down. I'm going to go around. I'm going to come down along there. And if I don't lift my finger, I can go over that more than once, and it won't make more than my 25% lightening. And so I'm going as far as I can go without getting into trouble in his neck. So I'm going to slip through here and do the lower one where my brush size is perfectly fine, and go right along, being careful not to get over the brighter part of it. And when I'm sure I've covered it, then I can lift my mouse button, come up to the neck, and make the brush smaller. And then I'm going to start up here near his head, and I'm just going to go back where I missed before. And I missed the little area down here in the wing, so I'm going to brush over that once. Now, I didn't make a huge difference, but I didn't want one. How do I find out what I did? I go to that layer, and I grab the eyeball, and I turn it off, and I turn it on. And I've done just what I wanted. I certainly wasn't going to change the angle of the light, but it's more obvious that there are feathers there than it was before. Then I want you to see what our strokes look like. If you want to see this layer completely and not see the picture, come to the background layer, to its eyeball, and shut off the background layer. Look how crude that painting was that I did. In fact, you can see that I actually skipped part of the neck, didn't I? But that's what it looks like when you're directly painting on a 50% gray layer. Bring the picture back so we don't have to look at that. Okay. Now, we could go over and work on the other one, but we're going to, well, it won't hurt to do it, just so you see the shortcomings of this method. I have my brush. I'm on that dodge and burn layer, and I'm working on the other side of the bird, and I've got to get out to the edge of that feather, so I've got to be very precise and use a small enough brush. And I'm going to brush over it carefully, really hard to do, because I don't want to touch the blue. And now I can go a little more, with a little more ease, to this very dark shadow, and I think this one I'll do a little. And I may even come down along this edge if I'm very careful. And then I can catch the underside of his tail feather. Okay. And I'm wondering first of all, we need to check what we did. So hide that layer, and then open it again, and we did a little bit of lightening on this. I want to see what our strokes look like, so I'm going to hide the background layer. You'll see they're pretty crude painted over there. And this was traditionally how we worked on dodging and burning. The only control I would have on this would be if my dodging and burning was too strong, I have some things I could do. I'm going to bring this picture to fit the screen. So I'm going to say View, Fit on Screen, Command or Control 0. And I'm going to turn it off and on. And it's very mild, but you can see the change, especially in the front bird. If I thought I had a harsh one, now I don't here, but if you do this and you feel it's overdone, you have two ways that you can soften it. One is to change the blend mode from overlay to soft light, and that will make it a little lighter. And the other thing you can do is to lower the opacity. By now, you probably are aware that one of the benefits in working in layers is that you can always lower the opacity of a layer. When you do that, you minimize the strength of the adjustment that took place on that layer. So actually, we could get rid of the whole adjustment by dragging the word opacity. It's called a sticky slider. Grab the word, hold your mouse button down, move to the left, and you lower the opacity. And you could go all the way down to 0, and you've gotten rid of all your work. And then you go all the way back to 100%, and you see it back again. This overview was to introduce the concept of a 50% gray layer and to show you the limitations on the method we used to use, where it was very difficult to isolate a subject away from its background, and it made it very difficult to use. So I'm going to move to a different tutorial and show you the more modern method of doing this.